welcome. I'm Barkha Dutt. You're with the Mojo Story, our independent digital platform that picks up one issue at a time and does a deep dive and in-depth analysis of it. On the program today, COVID, what else but COVID? But even while we're grappling with the pandemic itself, the vaccination rollout program, long COVID, and so many medical questions, this has been a year plus that is going to have deep impacts on the way our people interact with each other, men and women, women in the workforce, women at home. Here's what we do know. This has been a year from hell for everyone, but it has been a particularly different and difficult time for women. In some ways, what's been happening with women, not just here in India, but globally, is being called the shadow pandemic. And now a new survey that actually looks at what women have experienced in comparison to men. This is a Facebook survey that actually chronicles what's happening to women at home in particular, throws up some startling data on how women have experienced this pandemic differently from men. Remember, even here in India, we are seeing a surge in, for example, the complaints of domestic violence cases with the National Commission for Women. We're also seeing an increase in the number of women who are dropping out of the workforce. This has been a year and a half almost now when women have had to carry the bulk of the responsibility of what's going on at home. Children are at home, partners are at home. And even when women step out of the house to work, often men are not carrying 50% of the responsibility of what's going on at home. And that burden has just got even more skewed. To talk about this particular survey that has been done in partnership with a number of organizations, we are joined on the program now by Samhir Vasudev, who's the program manager at Facebook. And we're also joined by Cookson, who's the co-founder and director of research at Ladysmith. Ladysmith was a key partner with Facebook in this online survey of gender equality, or rather absence of equality at home. Welcome both, and thank you. This is such an important conversation, and in so many ways it's been called the shadow pandemic because it's a conversation that we're not having. It's not out there, it's not upfront because everybody's too busy, of course, talking about everything else, and those things are important, but there is an invisible impact really that women are experiencing that we're not calling out enough. Tara, let me start by asking you, obviously this is data that will vary from country to country. Even within a country, it might vary from region to region. It varies across classes certainly, or cultural groups. But the one big sort of global conclusion that is true for no matter where we live is that women are actually experiencing this pandemic in a very different way from men. So talk a little bit first about the big findings that your survey with Facebook led you to.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks so much for having me. So we did find that women and men were experiencing the pandemic differently, although the pandemic is affecting everybody in really quite significant ways. So, for example, in all regions, over a quarter of respondents reported experiencing food insecurity during COVID-19. And that was across world regions. So from 28% of respondents in North America on the lower end of the seam, but still, over a quarter of all respondents, to 70% of respondents in sub-Saharan Africa. We found that men actually in the Middle East, North Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean were more likely than women to report concerns in the future of their work. So we're seeing there a particular gender difference that seemed, at least within our survey population, to be experienced more likely by men. And then we found that women were more concerned overall about the amount of unpaid care and domestic work that they were doing. So those are a few high-level findings. I'm, really happy to dig into this further. But what we can certainly say is that it is very much gendered experiences of this pandemic.
And were the starkest differences experienced in terms of household responsibility? Because remember, this was a time when children were at home, spouses or partners were at home, and somehow this has always been true even in pre-pandemic years. Women are often saddled with a greater bulk of household chores, and that is why, especially in my part of the world, you actually see a declining female labor force participation, which means fewer women are working than earlier. Is that where your survey led you to believe was the greatest gendering of the experience, Tara?
Yeah, certainly in terms of what our survey collected data on, this was a significant finding. So for example, we can look at the findings even specifically for South Asia. Now, we asked questions about who was having the responsibility for unpaid care and domestic work. And we found, for example, that within the region of South Asia, women were significantly more likely to report taking care of cleaning. So 61% of women versus 29% of men. Cooking, 57% of women versus 23% of men. And household management, we see a little bit of a reverse. So 38% of men and 28% of women. And then meanwhile, if we look at different pots of chores within the kind of unpaid care and domestic work, we found that men rather reported being more likely to take care of subsistence farming, so 18% of men versus 5% of women, or collecting fuel. So we see some differences, but overall, it's very clear that women in general are taking care of unpaid care and domestic work, and that aligns with findings that we know, from previous surveys, previous studies, where globally women do 2.6 times as much unpaid care and domestic work as men. So this survey, one of the things that's really cool about it is it gets specifically into the online population. And we can see that within that population where, we assume that there's a little bit more gender equality, we've got typically higher levels of education, access to devices, which means access to markets, etc. We're actually still seeing this quite stark inequality when it comes to responsibility for unpaid care and domestic work.
Yeah, that's a great point, that there is no necessary correlation between increased education, being middle class or upper middle class, having access to the internet, and necessarily being more enlightened in terms of 50-50% in terms of work division at home in particular. Let me bring in Samhir just to understand the mechanics. And obviously, when we look at this data, it is confined in the online universe. But of course, Samhir, the online universe isn't what it used to be. The internet is not necessarily a luxury. It is not necessarily a tool only of the wealthy or even of the upper middle class or even strictly of the middle class anymore. Talk a little bit about the mechanics of who we're really talking about here when we talk about this survey.
No, that's a great point. And I think one of the most important things or exciting things about this particular survey is that it does exactly that, take advantage of the fact that there are billions of users on Facebook around the world, including in markets and communities like in India, where it's extremely popular without too much gendered difference between men and women accessing and using Facebook. In fact, our survey also did look at the self-reported ownership of computers and smartphone devices, and did not find significant gender differences in that as well. And so the purpose of this survey was to leverage that vast community, but also doing so in kind of privacy preserving opt-in ways, where rather than say tracking information about Facebook's users, we're inviting users to opt in to complete a survey about this topic. So what we're looking at globally is nearly 460,000 people who were surveyed globally over a 2-week period in the June-July period of last year. This is obviously not representative of the entire population. And in fact, there's some fantastic research that we plan to do with partners being led, for instance, by the World Bank to understand how representative this data set is of the global population. And the key here is the way they're doing this, which is fascinating. Working with the World Bank, Equal Measures, UN Women, and Ladysmith, of course, to design the survey, some of the specific questions that were delivered online on Facebook are also being shared or mirrored or reflect the same questions that, for instance, the World Bank issues in their maybe more conventional or traditional household surveys that reach the online and offline population. So this research is ongoing, but we're really excited in the next few months to understand how representative this data set is of, again, the 460,000 plus people it reached of the global population. So we look forward to some good insights there.
Yeah, it is. It is really compelling, and what it leads me to think about as I look at this data on our screen from that Facebook Gender Equality at Home survey, Tara, is that in some ways it holds a mirror to stereotypes that already exist. So, for example, if you do a deep dive on your data and you look at how Indian women surveyed responded, many of them have internalized that socialized message that household chores are primarily their responsibility. So they may not be happy about it, but they internalize that message. And then if you join the dots between COVID and the sort of the patriarchy that has already socialized societal attitudes, you get a pretty lethal sort of cocktail. There were other findings for our region that Bangladesh, for example, smaller country, neo-democracy, does better than India, relatively better than India on certain key indices of gender equality. What did you find, like which countries did well and which countries did not do so well, given the sort of health warnings that Samhir has put in terms of, the fact that this was, of course, strictly online?
Yeah, we're actually not looking so much to compare between countries, just because this data set doesn't allow us to do those comparisons in a really rigorous way. What it does allow us to do is look within countries. So we find, for example, really interesting differences between respondents in urban areas and rural areas in a number of countries, or between, gender, for example, or education. So that's actually, it's the looking within countries, the online population within countries, where we actually get the most interesting findings and are able to kind of also triangulate with other data sets. So, for example, in one of the research projects that Ladysmith is doing with this data, we're using the SIGI index, the Social Institutions and Gender Inequality Index, which has a lot of really interesting global indicators on gender norms. And so we're using that data and using this data from the Facebook survey to answer some really interesting questions, particularly around the sort of roles that society believes that women should hold or men should hold in relation to, as you were mentioning, care work, domestic work, and financial roles for men, responsibility, for taking care of the household. And if listeners on your show are interested, they can go to equalityathome.org to actually play around with the data and look within countries and, look at India and then compare rural and urban, for example, or go to Bangladesh and look at rural versus urban.
And I was just seeing a slide on the screen which said 73% of men agreed that household chores were primarily a woman's responsibility. This is our part of the world, and I wanted to say, of course, they would, right? But I think the point would be, Samhir, what happens? You've collected this data. We know we have these numbers, but these numbers have to be able to influence and impact policy in some way. So, what are you thinking of doing with this report and doing with this data in the real offline world?
It's a great point, and it's something that drives a big piece of what we do at this program at Facebook, which is a Data for Good program in partnership with my team, which focuses on advancing progress on the Sustainable Development Goals. Is how do we translate these insights into action or policy or advocacy that can make a difference in the real world? I think it begins with humility, right? We have to understand that Facebook, as a technology company, is not going to be making these changes all by itself. And that's why we rely so heavily on our partners. Facebook's entire approach to accelerating progress on the Sustainable Development Goals, and indeed on gender equality across the SDGs, is by putting partnerships first. And so one of our main kind of strategies here is to make sure that we can equip researchers and policymakers or policy influencers with the nuanced insights from this survey for them to be better equipped to encourage a particular policy or design policy. And so that's, for instance, why we're really grateful for all the inputs of the World Bank, who are designing research and also, as you probably know, can help influence the policy agenda of different government actors as well. And so one of the ways we can do that is by arming them with kind of de-identified record level data, we call it microdata, that's eligible to nonprofits and research institutions specifically and exclusively for the goal of advancing the Sustainable Development Goals or gender equality. That's one way we can do it, is by equipping researchers. Another one is to work with advocacy groups as well. So Equal Measures 2030, to an extent Ladysmith as well, researchers, I should say journalists and media organizations who can make use of this information to amplify the messages in here for advocacy purposes. And the last way that we can encourage it, I think, is where Facebook might play a convening role, or at least help to do that, is what Tara just mentioned about this survey's ability, perhaps not to answer or resolve many questions, but to triangulate with other sources of data. And so that's where we are trying to encourage, for instance, stakeholders as we design the second wave of this survey, like UNICEF, which is on education, again, the World Bank and others, to be able to bring to bear what their existing research says and what their planned projects and advocacy programs are, to compare those and to incorporate this survey into that. So it's a multi-pronged process. It starts with humility that we're not going to make the change ourselves, but hopefully by designing this hand in hand with partners, by undertaking efforts like this to let more researchers, journalists, media advocates, gender equality advocates know about this resource, that's a really important next step for us.
Yeah, and just in the end, Tara, before I come to you, because I think it's a great point about sort of advocacy and groups that can actually push for change. I just picked up from our live stream a comment from one of the women watching. It's not a woman's responsibility. She's obviously talking about household chores. I'm tired of seeing women in kitchen all the time. It's a thankless job if you have to do it 24/7. I've got tired where women push themselves, as we're all conditioned to think that it's our job, right? And I think that's really what this survey is focusing on. There's been a lot of talk about monetizing the work that women do. You've had change makers like Melinda Gates, for example, saying it's time to put money on that work, because just romanticizing it and saying, oh, women are so great at multitasking is actually what I call chains of gold. You make women run work as well as homes. And by the end of it, we're all ready to have like a nervous breakdown, quite seriously. So just a last thought on where you'd like to see this, when Samhir says data for good, where would you like this data? Which direction would you like it to travel in terms of advocacy for change?
Yeah, absolutely. So, at Ladysmith, we're a group of feminist researchers. And so we think that, using the data, using the evidence, using women's lived experiences, those are really, really important for seeing the kind of policy changes and changes within houses, changes within communities, social norms change that really needs to happen. India has, you mentioned Melinda Gates, but actually Melinda Gates draws on the work of a lot of really amazing Indian feminists and Indian economists, feminist economists, who have been talking about valuing women's care work for a really long time. You've got Naila Kabir, for example. We use her work a lot, and she's actually cited in a lot of the papers that we're writing out of this survey data. So I think, taking the data, drawing on feminists who are in the country in which you are, and creating evidence-based advocacy messages that can really push like policymakers for investments in policies that reduce and redistribute care through, safe and affordable daycare centers, safe and affordable elder care centers, for example, and social messaging that changes the behaviors that are within households too. It's that kind of sweet spot combination that's really needed.
And I mean, just to end, my sense is that actually as the dust settles down on COVID and the vaccine rollouts end, and we actually have a time to see what happens when people start emerging from the cocoons that they've been sort of bunkered down in, you'll have a lot more fresh data. You'll have a lot more trends available in terms of how this has actually altered lives, in particular professional lives for women. So we hope you guys keep doing what you're doing. Samhir, Tara, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much. The data has been of great use to our own research as we look at a declining female labor force participation in India. That's a big area of our research. So it's really helped us already. And we hope to see much more from you. But thank you in the meantime for talking to us. Take care and have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye. Take care. Bye. It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.